Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, we have several developments of the Russian armed forces advancing in the Kurakhove direction from the north, east, and south. There's also some positional fighting in the Kupiansk section of the front line. Starting out in the south, the Russians have advanced both northeast of Boyavlenka, northwest of Konstantinivka, southeast of Kurakhove, just east of Kurakhove, and in the northwestern direction towards the flank of Kurakhove. Taking a look at the fortified positions, we see that the Russians have managed to capture some very well fortified positions east of Kurakhove, right by the entrance of it, securing their foothold within the settlement and flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians, creating a pocket from the northern side and from the southeastern side, where the Russians are looking to flank the Ukrainian positions, fortified positions in the forest lines here in the east. The Ukrainians have several lines of defense here near Kurakhove, and the Russians are storming them head on. With the control over the fortified positions here in the eastern parts, the main resistance to the Russian infiltration into Kurakhove itself is now over. There will be no direct fire on the Russian positions as long as the Russians hold this fortified position. Therefore, the Russians will be able to drive into the settlement under the cover of heavy artillery strikes on Kurakhove. Kurakhove itself is split into two parts. There's this river area going through separating the eastern and central parts of the settlement, where the eastern parts is less congested. There is more free room, while in the western side it's hardly possible for armored vehicles and tanks to maneuver within the settlement. They will only be able to drive through the roads, maybe drive into some of the buildings, but it'll generally be very difficult and they can be set up for ambushes. Therefore, it is likely that the Russians will gain control of the eastern parts, move along the fortified positions to gain control over the entire area here in the southeast of Kurakhove, before moving in through the southern parts into the northern parts of the settlement and infiltrating with infantry across the choke point here in the eastern parts of the settlement. So we see that the Russians will likely continue along the fortified positions, gain control over more of it as they heavily bombard the Ukrainian positions. There are several high-rise apartment complex buildings here in the western parts of Kurakhove, as well as in the southern parts of it towards the outskirts. This will make it difficult for the Russians to move towards the settlement from the south, and at the same time be a choke point here in the western parts as well, where the Ukrainians can hold up in these apartment complex buildings and avoid the majority of the artillery fire. This is likely where most of the FPV drone operators are located within the city itself. In general, if we'd have to take an in-depth analysis look at Kurakhove, it can be split into four different parts. There is the apartment complex building area in the western parts and southern parts of the settlement. It is connected to one line of defense that is located here in the western parts. If we redraw it in the yellow color, so we can clear it and define it as the Ukrainian side compared to the Russian side being red. There's the industrial area in the western parts. Then there's the residential parts in the central parts, and then there's the eastern parts of the settlement. On top of that, there's the fortified lines south of the city. This does not include the city itself. So based on this, we see that the Russians have a foothold in one of the parts, which is the eastern residential area. And this is not a difficult area for the Russians to gain control of. Of course, it's going to be requiring a lot of heavy fighting to gain control over the eastern parts of the settlement. But it is not somewhere where the Ukrainians can put up a heavy resistance, because the Russians can heavily bombard it with artillery and FAB bombs, and the resistance will just be demolished. Instead, they'll be focused around the apartment complex buildings, where they can survive for much longer and concentrate more forces for a stronger resistance. This means that in general, the Russians will be focusing on gaining this foothold, where they'll be able to have some sort of presence within the residential area of Kurakhove. And it will also allow the Russians to move up their artillery and other equipment closer for more accuracy and more effect. As for the fortified positions outside of the city, it is clear that the Russians are moving along the forest lines, dropping off some infantry near the forest lines, after which the infantry, after being dropped off at the entrance, move alongside them and continue moving along them towards the frontline positions. These fortified positions are not trenches, they are anti-tank ditches, they are dragon teeth. They're a line that is supposed to prevent armored vehicles from passing through. So the Russian infantry simply move past it. This will allow the Russians to then clear the next line, which is the trenches and fortified positions of the Ukrainians. We see that there is the frontline trenches moving along the first lines. Then there's some rear trenches to allow the Ukrainian troops to move between the northern and southern sides. So we see that the Russians are now going to be facing off against the Ukrainian forces at the front line positions, which is their fortified lines and trenches. This means that the Ukrainian positions where infantry is present and preventing a Russian advance is right there. This part here and this part here is anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth. This is why the capture of this fortified position is very significant, because it allows the Russians to flank the fortified lines and trenches of the Ukrainians to the south of the fortified position, to flank the dragon teeth from the northern direction, allowing for armored vehicles to drive through, and flank the next defensive position of the Ukrainians. Capturing this line here and the position here will allow the Russians to then have a very strong position and foothold in the eastern parts, allowing them to create openings in their defenses and advance through the main highway towards Kurakhove itself. But again, the Ukrainians simply have ATGM units set up in Kurakhove. They have FPV drone operators, they have artillery, they have everything they can have to withstand against a Russian armored assault, which makes an armored assault unfeasible without cover from buildings as they did in the northern parts, to cover from direct fire of the ATGMs, for example, and also to cover for the vision of the Ukrainian forces. In this sense, it is unlikely that the Russians will launch an armored assault until they have cleared the outskirts of Kurakhove, which is capturing the apartment complex areas in the southern parts of the city and generally capturing the entire eastern parts of it. This will allow the Russians to then launch armored assaults towards the city itself, significantly increasing the offensive capabilities of the Russian forces within it. At the same time, the Russians are fighting in the northern bank of the Vovcha River line. Capturing Ilinka and Beretsky will allow the Russians to have direct fire over the northern parts of Kurakhove and will allow for the Russians to then cover the northern outskirts, which will allow the Russians to use that to gain a foothold in the central residential area of Kurakhove. At the same time, we see that this is simply to gain control over the eastern fortified positions of Kurakhove and to gain a presence within Kurakhove that is so significant that they can actually launch offensive operations towards the apartment complex buildings. Securing those will likely happen from the eastern parts and then moving upwards towards the apartment complex areas through the eastern residential area. Therefore, it is unlikely that we'll see a significant push here in the eastern parts, but instead capturing these trenches on the east will allow the Russians to flank the Ukrainian positions further south, closing this pocket which is being formed south of Dalne along the river line, moving through Konstantinivka. This is why we're seeing positional fighting on all of the flanks directly towards it, and generally to push the Ukrainians back and push them out of the pocket while heavily bombarding all of the Ukrainian positions within it. Further north, the Russians have made a significant push towards Surya and Sontsivka, where the Russians have managed to gain a foothold in both of the settlements, pushing directly into Surya and then along the northern parts of Sontsivka into the settlement. The Ukrainians from their positions here within the settlement would have a weak point of view sides here in the northwestern parts, as there's some forest lines covering their view. They would have to rely on drones. On the eastern side, there's an open view. This is why the Russians have clearly launched an assault along the first lines here to the east, pushing into the first lines, capturing those east of the settlement, and from that launching assaults into the settlement, where they've managed to gain a foothold. And then through the cover of the first areas, they would have launched an assault from that direction, following the capture of the eastern outskirts, pushing the Ukrainian forces towards the northern parts where they have barely any view, and then infantry would likely have been dropped into the first area here to give a fire support and do some reconnaissance into the northwestern parts of the settlement. Gaining control over that as well will allow the Russians to then push across the Solona River into Sonsivka here in the southern parts of the settlement, and then gain control over that as well, with the fortified positions of the Ukrainians pointing in a downwards direction. Beyond Sonsivka, there is Stariterny to the south, Shevchenko to the southwest, and Petropavlivka to the west, Slovianka west of Soria. These are 4 different settlements, which all are well connected with the defensive positions and fortified lines of the Ukrainians. The Russians would have the advantage that they're coming from the flank and not attacking them head on, but instead from the rear. However, there is a large field between that of the Russian positions and the Ukrainian positions, which generally means that it is difficult to push from one settlement to another. They will have to rely on armored assaults, and depending on the Ukrainian ability to withstand that, it will be difficult for them to deal with it. But with the heavy fighting in Kurakhove, much of the firepower is likely located there, focused there to prevent a Russian breakthrough into the city itself in the central parts. And therefore, the Russians may be able to divert the Ukrainian resources by attacking all of the flanks. And this is why the front line is so wide, because they want to divert the Ukrainian forces as much as possible, allowing for offensive operations on a wider front. The Russians are here relying on their ability to flank the Ukrainian fortified positions to launch these larger and stronger armored assaults towards the Ukrainian positions. Southwest of Novoalexivka, the Russians continue offensive operations, flanking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians. Here to the south of Novoselivka, north of Soria, the objective is to move along the fortified positions and to flank their supply lines, preventing reinforcements from being sent. Capture the fortified positions bit by bit, moving along the forest lines towards Pushkine in the west, as they slowly move towards Ukrainka as well, along the highway connected between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove in the south. Northwest of Selidove, the Russians have managed to capture the remaining parts of Petrivka as they move along the railways. Their offensive operations continue in this direction, both towards the flank of Pustinka and in the northern parts of the settlements located northwest of Selidove following the capture of the city. So heavy fighting continues all across the Kurakhove and Selidove section of the front line. In the northern direction, the Russians have captured a few fields and forest lines here to the north of Vishneve as they secure the area following the capture of the settlement and continue offensive operations towards Losova. They'll likely launch towards Seleny High and down south towards Kupanki, flanking the Ukrainian positions near Nadia and the Serbs River line here west of Svatove. So far, there are no reports of additional advances by the Russians here in the Kursk region, so we're remaining that as it is. And until next time, thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.